how did we get here? How is it that in philosophy departments and feminist departments, we can't even agree on a millennia-long definition of the word woman?
So the silly answer is that philosophers love to not agree, and our discipline is actually based on fragmentation, not consensus. The more serious answer, at least in my discipline for how we got here, I think it's that feminist philosophers in particular, but maybe actually a lot of academics, they're not doing their jobs properly. The woman becomes a sort of free-floating idea that other people can take up. Gender is whatever the stuff is that we make females be like because they're females and males be like because they're male. It does seem like certain younger women are starting to see that liberal feminism is bullshit and it's not really offering them the critical resources that they need. It does seem like there's a sort of hunger and appetite for real feminism, and that is taking people back toward the radical feminist and second wave text. So I have maybe a bit more hope for a resurgent feminist movement than I do for overturning trans laws. Yeah.
All right. Today on Beyond Gender, we would like to welcome Holly Lawford-Smith, who is the author of many books, including this one, Gender Critical Feminism, which I can say from personal experience is a very excellent, well-written book.
I appreciate that you've color-coded your Post-it notes. Impeccably done.
Okay, thank you. My mother was an interior decorator.
Really
so
nice.
I do those things. So
we got straight into the deep stuff there.
Yeah. If it's okay, I would like to start off with a little quote from the book, because to me it really speaks to something that perhaps is on a lot of people's minds, and but I'll just, it's short and I'll read it and we'll see where things lead. But you say, pointing to the fact of social construction when the meaning of a thing is pernicious or hurts people is often a first step in finding a way to deconstruct it. This is exactly what the second wave feminists, were trying to do when they first made use of the sex-gender distinction. The strategy makes sense when it's deployed against things like money and universities, but it's absolutely hopeless against things like rocks and trees. And then later you make the point that sex is like rocks and trees.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love that, because for lots of reasons, but I would love you to unpack that and just say more if you could.
Yeah, I guess this is a sort of familiar debate inside philosophy about the nature of reality and which things are socially constructed. And then I guess a separate debate about the status of what is socially constructed compared to the things that are not, because there's a whole irritating debate, as you might predict, about what is real and what exists and what is on a par with what else. But the point there is really trying to bring to light the feminist distinction between woman or female as she really is, and maybe at a minimum, which gets you to all the ways she could have been. And you could understand that in the really long evolutionary view, if history had been really different, or you could just understand it within a lifetime, if she had had different parenting or different social influences or different opportunities. So there's the raw material of her, and then there's what she ends up being kind of shaped or molded or constructed into. And again, that's going to look a bit different in the long view, all cultural ideas about women and femininity, versus in the shorter view of what has happened to me within my lifetime, for example. But it's a way of pointing to the socialized part of who I am, or what's not actually necessary to me. And then for feminists to try to say that thing is our enemy, the socially constructed stuff, femininity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the reasons that quote stuck out to me And one of the reasons I wanted to share it is because I feel really sympathetic to the sex gender distinction as people were trying to use it, because I can see the value of saying, okay, there's sex, just the gross biological reality of different types of bodies. And then there's all of these, connotations and cultural meanings and socialization that gets affixed to it. And I can see how people would want like another word that makes that distinction, because one really changes a lot through space and time, and the other is much more fixed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's tricky. And I guess one thing that has caused a lot of confusion in this area. So you have your sex gender distinction, and I think we all know what has happened to gender lately. Like it's not that same concept as the socially constructed stuff that the raw material of femaleness has been turned into or whatever. But you also have this problem that a lot of the feminists in like academia use the word woman as the like success term for this gender thing. So then you have this idea that a woman is the name of a person successfully socialized feminine. And that has also led to all sorts of problems, because then you want to be like a women's liberationist, but you're stuck sort of like, there are literally people I'm sure in every discipline, but the ones I know are in philosophy, who are woman abolitionists, because they see that as a sort of like oppressed social position. So you get into all these difficulties with language and with what you're talking about, and you get this thing that has happened more recently of like the woman becomes a sort of free floating idea that other people can take up. Like all of those problems are downstream from being unclear about those terms and distinctions.
Yeah. That kind of brings me to another part that I wanted to quote when you said free floating idea or something. In your book, you cite a really well-known phrase from Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex.
Mm-hmm.
And the well-known phrase that's probably been oversighted is, one is not born, but rather becomes woman.
Yeah.
And in the context of that book, it's abundantly clear that Simone is talking about how, females are socialized into certain types of behaviors and have certain expectations, put upon them, etc.
Right.
And then Judith Butler comes along and she cites that same iconic phrase, and she takes it in a completely different direction. And I just want to quote Judith when she says, "The female body is the arbitrary locus of the gender woman."
Yeah. But you can sort of see the logic to it, right? Because once you've reified this thing, like, okay, we've got this neat package of stuff that we've sort of shaped and pushed and molded the female to be like. She's got contained body movements, and she's decorative, and she's submissive, whatever your list of stuff is. It's easy to sort of say like, okay, we'll give that a name, like call that woman or call that femininity, whatever you want to say. It's this package. The female could have been otherwise, so maybe the male could have been that. Like it just becomes this thing that's now maybe like it's an attractive package for some people that they might want to take up or put on. So it's like they are sort of saying two sides of the same idea. It's just that Beauvoir's concern is the freedom of the female from this imposition, whereas Butler is almost like, hey, cool stuff we could start playing with or messing around with, or stop performing or do what we want with or whatever. She's focused on the package and Beauvoir's focused on the female.
Could I ask you before we get any further? I'm kind of conscious of listeners. Could you give us what your understanding of sex and gender critical is, if you follow me?
Sure.
So that people kind of know what you're talking about in case they don't.
No, sure. So I have the predictable gender critical feminist dogmatic Twitter proclamation on what sex is, which is just gamete, like large and small gamete production. I take gender to be this second wave sense of gender, so certainly not gender as identity. but gender as a set of external norms, sort of social ideas imposed on people on the basis of sex. And that's important because it means when you talk about gender abolition or gender elimination, as they did, you are just pointing to whatever was socially constructed. So if like the evolutionary psychologists win and it turns out that there's female brains predicting all sorts of like female dispositions and behaviors, that's not part of gender abolitionism. Gender is whatever the stuff is that we make females be like because they're females and males be like because they're male. That's really important. It often gets overlooked in some of the discussions, like skepticism about gender abolition, but because of particular like scientific presumptions, I guess would be the thing. And then gender critical, I guess, is just an attempt to reassert that understanding of gender in the face of contemporary concept creep or revision toward the idea that gender is an identity, or uptake for the Butler move where you kind of reify this package of traits but treat it as something that like people can discover about themselves by revelation. And there's a lot more to say about gender critical feminism as an enterprise, but that's maybe just enough for the like definitions stage.
When did it first arrive, gender critical feminism? What is the arc of it?
You know, I've forgotten the exact year because I said something slightly inaccurate in my book. I think I just pointed to, and now was it 2014-ish? I might even be remembering that wrong. But I pointed to this kind of year where the Reddit r/gender critical began, and where there was this piece in, I think it was it the Atlantic? Sorry, I'm like vague on all the details now 3 years later or whatever it is, but there was this piece about the gender critical trans people, which included Corinna Cohen as one of the outspoken people. And so it was around that time, but someone on Twitter after the book came out actually tracked it to like what looked like its very first usage. And I think that was a year or two earlier. I've just sort of forgotten the exact details of that, but it was kind of around that time. And one thing I found really interesting about that was like when I came into the debate in 2018 or so, it was very trans focused. But when you look back to what was happening around that 2014 time where it started to become popular and get lots of uptake, I think the Reddit thread had maybe 80,000 subscribers or so. It was very rad fem. Like it was mentioning things like patriarchy and maybe relationships and pornography. Like it had these classic second wave feminist preoccupations, and trans was just one of them. And so for me, that was a kind of interesting almost affirmation of the sense that like this is actually a movement really grounded in a feminist impulse to care about female people and what's been going on with them. It's just that it's become like very fixated on trans issues because of what's been happening in the culture. And my hope in writing the gender critical feminism book was to like get people to realize that in a way, like people that had the trans focus, get them to see that there's all these logically connected broader issues, so that hopefully at the other end of trans, we're all still caring about pornography and domestic violence and sex work and all these other types of issues.
Well, let's do that. Let's talk about something that's not trans and gender and is also from your book. You make a really, I think, a great point about the distortion of the word victim, that the word victim has now come to mean someone without agency, someone who suffers harm and has no agency. And you make the point that that's really not what it means, and that a person can have agency and still be a victim. And that sort of logic, the other logic, is used to kind of justify sex workers. Like, they're deciding to do it, so it must be okay. There's no victim here because these women are deciding to, sell their bodies, which, I thought was an excellent point. And I imagine it goes to what you were just saying, all these other issues that are interconnected that don't really have to do with trans per se.
Right. Right. No, this is like, I found myself sort of going to war on liberal feminism. Maybe, I know there's a bit of conceptual confusion here. So sort of whatever is the culturally dominant form of feminism. I think in the book, I just called it mainstream feminism, but it really is a sort of a form of liberal feminism. It gets so much wrong, and it really doesn't serve women's interests. And the way that you just noted is one of the ways, right? Like there's such a strong rhetoric these days about like, well, if a woman chooses it, that's kind of the end of the matter. Like the be all and end all for sex is consent. And the be all and end all for sex work or featuring in pornography is she agreed or she accepted it or she got paid or she chose it or whatever. And so we end up setting this really high bar on what it would take for there to be a problem, like a political problem. Maybe she had to have been sex trafficked, or she had to have been raped or subject to serious coercion. And again, like as a feminist, I think you want to be able to say more than that. You want to be able to look around at a society that is promulgating all sorts of horrifying ideas about women and what women are for through pornography, and say something a little more critical and constructive that will like help younger women who are seeing that stuff and struggling with what to think about it. You want to be able to say something more than, well, she chose it and that's her choice, or that's empowering for her and each person gets to decide that for themselves.
Right.
Maybe there's some set of social conditions that are so sufficient. Right? That wasn't the word you expect to come after so, but like there might be some conditions where there's like a very strong welfare state, very good education, like a very good awareness of like, well, there's a lot of cultural propaganda out there about what women are meant to be like, decorative and for men to have sex with, and but just ignore that, you get to be a sports hero or an astronaut. Like maybe there's some sort of society where it's good enough that then we want to say, if a woman still chooses that line of work or accepts that kind of sexual practice in her interpersonal relationships, then we should all just like be libertarian about it. Like just everyone gets to make their own choices. I just don't think that we are in those social conditions, either economically or in terms of feminist kind of awareness and consciousness. And so there is a role, I think, for the more outspoken or militant feminists to be like, that's not what a woman is. That's not what a woman is for. Like a woman can be and do anything. Let's get away from the sex and the beauty stuff and toward these other sorts of options.
It seems like a lot of the points that you're raising and that, you know, we could associate with the argument regarding consent can be applied to things like the sex positive movement, because it seems like that's the thing. As long as it's two consenting adults, it's perfectly fine. But to me, that opens just like a kind of a Pandora's box of like all these different behaviors that I think people have the right to say, no, there's just something wrong here. It feels wrong. It feels morally repugnant. Something's not right. Even if the two people are saying, yeah, I'm willing, you know.
Because so much of that is just like people going along with what they think they're supposed to be doing because they saw it in porn maybe, and actually neither party are enjoying themselves. And a lot of it is like, again, I don't really know what explains this in this day and age, but the kind of learned passivity or helplessness of girls. I had that in my own childhood, and I don't know why, because I was raised very like strong girls can do anything style, and yet I still had that tendency to like really let boys lead or almost just like acquiesce in whatever a boy wanted to be doing, maybe until it crossed some really serious line. And I know a lot of other girls had a similar experience. So if you plug that kind of thing, whatever explains it, into people then trying to do like increasingly risky and serious sexual practices, you're going to get a dynamic where it's men taking those risks and girls going along with it. And indeed, what you do see, right, is like an increase in the kinds of injuries that we're seeing, like injuries from anal sex or risky choking behavior and all that kind of stuff.
The whole question of consent just seems like we cannot get this right, because we're also at the same time saying that, 14-year-old girls or 14-year-old boys can consent to medical procedures that we know that they're going to regret, and that cognitively they're just not well enough developed to be able to really understand the meaning of what they're consenting to, in which case there's no consent.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know how that works in the case of sex. Like, yeah, if it would mean something like a change in the age of consent, or it would just mean like way more and way different types of education are needed. Like in the case of medical interventions, I can easily get myself on board with an 18 or 19 years old only. No one under that age can do that. With sex, it's just a little more complicated, right? Because people are going through puberty and they're ragingly attracted to each other in high school, and things are going to happen. And yeah, it's like, how do you get that to be respectful? How do you get it so that people are learning but not like exploiting one another, not going along with things that they don't actually feel comfortable with? Yeah, I don't know enough, or I haven't thought enough what exactly is the right intervention. I'm still maybe at the point of like, I know what the problem is. Yeah.
Could I ask you, what does, radical feminism, which is, I presume, your stable, what do you make of the impact of testosterone and estrogen on the individual, if you follow me? Like, how much is that impacting society, let's say you were describing yourself as a little girl and the little boys around you. Where does that fit into the social construction?
Look, there is room within the tent of radical feminism to be open to the idea of biological influences on the sexes. It's not that radical feminism insists upon sameness and would just be like proven wrong by some result like that. But I personally would lean more toward the side of the sameness feminists within that group, just because whenever I've always had a like real suspicion of evolutionary psychological claims. And again, that's just because in my high school or whatever, I cannot tell you the number of times I had to listen to like stupid boys claiming that all men cheat. Like, it's just that thing where it's almost triggering at a certain point, because it's just like this weird science bro assertion, but you're not yet at the age where you know how to debunk it. You just have the sense that something's wrong there, but you don't yet have all the resources that you need to say what's wrong. Okay, but now I'm like 42 and I'm teaching feminism and I've got the time. So I have been looking into it for this course I've been teaching over the last 6 years. And so I've looked a bit into their arguments, and I've looked a bit into the brain sex research. And my conclusion, I have not read everything yet because there's a lot, but where I'm leaning is like there just absolutely is not the evidence to support the idea that there's a real sex difference in behavior on evolutionary grounds, whether that runs through the hormones or some other mechanisms. There just isn't the evidence. There's like most male and female behavior is the same, like within the same range. And then there's like some, I know not drawing that well in the imaginary whiteboard, largely overlapping bell curves. That would be the way to get the visual. Yeah, and so that makes me very like, sorry, this ties back to something that Brett, you said before about sex. It's like the people who are being critical about sex at the moment tend to have like an evolutionary psychology set of assumptions. And so they come into this criticizing, but the way they tell it is like, oh, females have kind of adapted to male sexual practice, as though there's something about the male human nature that's very like promiscuous and wants to be having tons of casual sex, and the female like sexual liberation has just been the female becoming male in a sense. Whereas I think like there's got to be room for a critique of sex that doesn't depend on the idea of like distinct categories of human, the male type and the female type. So that's where I'm at, but it is an empirical question and will depend on like the eventual settling of the empirical evidence. I just don't think there's the evidence for distinct categories of persons.
I imagine that a counter argument that people could launch would be, to just look at cross-cultural differences that seem fairly consistent. I mean, it seems fairly consistent that men tend to be more violent, whether or not they're in a particular place.
Cross-culturally, there has been patriarchy, right? So again, yes, you're right that this is the thing they wheel out. They say like, oh, cross-culturally, it's been quite similar. Oh, we're quite similar to other animals that are a little bit like us. Like, oh, you see the gorillas being quite dominant or whatever. They have these moves. But the thing is, like, patriarchy is like way back in our evolutionary history. And it's going to be a feature, like, depending whose story you buy about when it started and exactly why, it's certainly going to be a feature of our societies, at least since nation states. And so then being like, oh, look how similar it has been across all these cultures and times. Like, no kidding. Men have been dominant and solidified their dominance. Like, we are going to expect to see sex differences. The question is just like, what is the best explanation of those differences? Are they really like our innate biology that cannot be civilized or suppressed no matter what we do? Or are they our continued learning of cultural ideas that we just haven't yet managed to like put in the bin? And I'm in the camp, we haven't managed to put them in the bin yet.
or they could be our innate drivers that can be trained and, evolve as time goes on, if you follow me. So
Yes.
you could argue that the patriarchy is as a result of testosterone, which seems to be a very powerful hormone, and therefore a dominance kind of spread from, different cross cultures because of this extraordinary hormone, which, I since I've met so many detransitioners, I can't get over the impact of testosterone. And when testosterone leaves the female, the detrans female, just the impact on her, if you follow me.
But surely
And so
you don't
that
think
could-
that her taking drugs is the same as a man having a hormone that is natural to him. Like, she's on steroids.
No.
And he's
Yeah.
just having his body that's adapted through our whole evolutionary history. So
I
that
know, but
cannot
I'm
be...
getting a glimpse.
I
No,
don't
it's not
think
the
you
same,
are.
you're right,
I
it's
don't think you're getting a
synthetic.
glimpse. I don't think you're getting a glimpse. I think saying like, look at
You
these
know?
people who take drugs and go crazy is not the same as saying, look at this person for whom that drug is produced naturally by their biological system. That's just two totally separate things.
Okay, but go back to my point about the patriarchy. Might the patriarchy be driven by testosterone as opposed to any sort of explanation that is, societal explanation?
Look, there's two things there. One is like, yes, it could be that we were given some sorts of impulses, and then the man we see today has some slightly different like impulses or instincts or whatever than the woman we see today. And the question is just, what can civilization and culture do to get some self-restraint going in both cases? That could be a difference. But I certainly would not be hanging my hat on testosterone as the story, because there are just like many competing explanations for what is going on with Homo sapiens. One really interesting one is like the role of dads is like very distinctive in our species. So at some point, the dads started doing childcare and sticking around, and that was very different to some of our like nearest ape ancestors or whatever. And so the fatherhood difference of like the pair bonding parenting team really changed how things were for Homo sapiens. That's not an explanation of like testosterone created violence and dominance or whatever. It's just a totally other explanation of like how things have ended up being this way. And again, I need to read all of philosophy of biology before coming to a conclusion about what's the best explanation there. But I'm just saying, like, I would like to see the discourse get past the like sex hormones focus and the people who are really like pushing that as an explanation of the sex differences we see now. I'm a bit frustrated with that discourse, I have to say.
So in that case, how do you feel about what's sometimes called difference feminism? Writers like Carol Gilligan, who wrote In a Different Voice, and I remember reading her book, and I kind of appreciated it because it I think it spoke to like kind of different ethical value systems existing in men and women, but in a way that I didn't think privileged one over the other. It just said there's sort of these different value systems that we can acknowledge to our own. Yeah.
And before you answer, for those in the back of the class, can you give a bit of an explanation about what that's about?
Well, I guess there's two versions, right? So one is, as Brett just said, we're not really making any claims about the deep explanation of the difference. The Gilligan style view could just be like, for whatever reason, including social ones, women have ended up with this set of traits and aptitudes, and men have ended up with this one. And what Gilligan noticed was like, there was a sort of tendency in psychology to assume the male and generalize him. And she was saying, yeah, but actually when I talk to women, they're reasoning in a completely different way, especially about moral problems. Like they're focused on interpersonal relationships, and they just had a really different set of concerns. So one feminist move would just be to say like, yeah, who cares why we're different? But the positive political project is to like reaffirm and celebrate our differences. And so that's one way of being a difference feminist. Like, who cares why? We just are now at this point, and we should try to achieve equality by getting equal respect for these two like sets of behaviors. We should work for accommodation for our differences, and that's sufficient. And the more extreme, I don't know if that's the right word, version would be a more biological one, where it's like, maybe you rely on the evolutionary psychology or some other evolutionary theory to be like, no, men and women are really like two different kinds of creatures almost. and then we could be like female supremacists, like they're different, but the females are the good ones. So we need to flip the patriarchy into a matriarchy. Or you could be like, the challenge is to achieve equality and accommodate difference both ways. So get rid of the male standard and try to have just like a standard that is like, could be like those guys or could be like those guys. So it's quite a different political challenge that you're facing for women's equality or women's liberation, depending whether you have that like stronger model or the weaker model in mind. And arguably the stronger model is more risky, because if you're wrong that there are these two inevitable types of people, then you're just like really claiming the name of feminism while spreading this kind of complete garbage about women's nature to women. That's really risky if you're wrong. Whereas the weaker model, the Gilligan style, might just be like, look, for now, let's try to up women's status by celebrating these differences. But in 10 years' time, we can actually, like, we'll probably all be way more similar to each other anyway. And it won't be plausible to think that like men and women are really so different.
You were making a point earlier, and I think it was when we were recording, and I wrote down something. I don't know if it's accurate, but this idea, gender is abolished when expectations are eliminated, not when differences are abolished. Yeah. I think it'd be great to clarify that, because that kind of sways me towards feeling like more allied with a lot of what you're saying.
Yeah, this is just to like re-emphasize, I think, as I've said a few times now, that we should be open to the evidence, right? Feminists should not be dogmatists, and neither should trans activists, and neither should anyone else. Like, this is not a religion. So if we're open to the evidence, we should just wait to see what it says about whether there is sex difference and what it is like. And again, then that might end up reducing the scope of what you think it is that is this external problem, gender. So like maybe the second wave feminists thought, the social stuff includes getting women to be really like decorative in her presentation. That's almost certainly social. Like, it's really hard to see how there would be some, maybe with peacocks or something, you could tell a story about the decorative one of the species, like you tell some complicated story, maybe. But to me, it's much more plausible. Like, that stuff is kind of culturally learned and could very easily be unlearned, as you actually see in like the presentation of proper feminists. They're just normal people. But yeah, there'll be stuff that's like, if that thing is more plausibly explained by these inherited impulses or whatever it is, like the more nurturing instinct or just whatever you want it to be, that thing would just then be outside the scope of your gender abolitionism. So if it turns out females are naturally more like whatever, caring and tending to want to stay at home and look after children, then your feminist project would be getting rid of beauty norms and beauty expectations and presentational differences, but leaving the maternity stuff alone. That's one way things could go. Again, as I already said, I'm skeptical that there's going to end up being any such difference. And I kind of just think we're all more or less the same, but that I have to be empirically open about that.
Could I ask you about the peacock feminism? What I'm thinking about is, that I in many ways when I first came into this debate, I was so clueless about feminism. I really didn't know anything about it, and I kind of get in because of kids, trans, and all this. So I literally knew nothing. And I kind of learned my slogans as such. I was told by many people, sex is our biological state of being. It's immutable and things, and gender is a social construct. And it kind of went in like in my first year of this world that that's what I needed to learn.
Yeah.
And since then, I've thought about it quite some bit, and I've thought like, well, imagine if I was born a female, and imagine if my gender
just
could be yeah, supposing. Let's take a hypothesis there. A good strong one though. I'm a woman.
I can very well imagine.
My gender could be driven. It might not be a social construct at all. It could be driven by biology, because I could have certain traits related to my sex that I have developed, and to attract a mate, to attract somebody, you know what I mean, to have children. I know it's quite evolutionary, but it could be.
It could be.
That could be exactly what gender. So it mightn't be at all a social construct. It could be literally a biological kind of offspring of my biology. My sex is my. Yeah, do you follow my
yes,
it's
absolutely.
not necessarily this whole idea.
No,
yeah.
But there's two things to say. One is that just then wouldn't be gender, is my point.
Oh.
So you say like, well, my gender, and then you refer to like these things but your gender is not just like you wearing a beautiful dress, right? It's what explains that. So for the second waiver, it's the external thing to the real female, the man, the dad or whatever, enforcing on her norms about how to be like a proper little girl or woman or whatever. So if you're wearing the beautiful dress because of these ideas that have been shoved on you, that's gender in the sense that the second waiver wants to like eliminate or narrow it, zero in on and eliminate. If you just have some innate, inherited impulse to be like decorative in a way that's going to attract a man, and that's the explanation of your behavior, then that is not gender for the purposes of the second wave feminist. That's just you, the human. She wants to get rid of the things that you are being socially constructed into that are not actually in your nature. Does that make sense?
It does, but I'm wondering what is in my nature and what is socially constructed. That's very hard.
That's the question. Yeah, but this is like not for me to answer. This is a huge, like this is like half the disciplines in academia are trying to figure this out, right? So there's the lengthy nature-nurture debate about all humans. There's all the brain sex stuff, trying to vindicate the claim that males and females really are innately different because the gray matter in the blah blah region. Like there's a whole industry trying to figure out for humans alone what of our behavior is kind of like culturally learned and could easily be changed versus what are we sort of stuck with. And then there's the sex differentiated version of that where the hope seems to be to vindicate the idea that men and women are really different from each other. So it's just like a huge ongoing question. And I'm just saying some of this feminist move depends on the answer to those questions, because anything that can be shown that it really is just in the female's nature unavoidably, or at least it would be really hard to socially change, that's not gender then. or at least maybe you want to say, well, I really want the word gender for that. Okay, fine. Then we'll come up with some other word for the socially constructed further aspects that are constraining and oppressive to her. And we'll be abolitionists about that stuff. And you can have gender for the like naturally occurring biological peacock behaviors.
Yeah, how exciting. A new word.
Since we're throwing massive questions at you, here's one. How did we get here? How is it that in philosophy departments and feminist departments, we can't even agree on a millennia-long definition of the word woman? I mean, how is this possible?
There's a silly answer and a serious answer. The silly answer is that philosophers love to not agree, and our discipline is actually like based on fragmentation, not consensus. And there's some funny accounts of this, like I think it was the Nuffield Bioethics Council. They tried to get some ethicists in from philosophy departments to help them with some really difficult like medical ethics. And of course, they're like, what's the state of the art in your discipline? None. There is none, because the whole thing is to like almost like map out the logical space of possible positions and assess how weak and strong they are. It's something like that. And the incentives are like to say something new or surprising, not to agree with your pals in the discipline. So that's just something about philosophy itself. But if you want the more serious answer, at least in my discipline, for how we got here, I think it's that feminist philosophers in particular, but maybe actually a lot of academics, they're not doing their jobs properly. They're not taking seriously the privilege of tenure to be difficult people. They're not asking the critical questions. And so much of feminist philosophy in particular, it reminds me of, have you guys ever done improv? I did like a improv class in undergrad, and the first thing they taught us was like, it's always yes and. That's the rule. You can never say no. You never shut down someone else's idea. You give enthusiastic uptake to everyone's idea, and then you run with it and go somewhere else. So yes and. My sense of feminist philosophy is yes and it's almost based on like deference to the more marginalized. So some like Mexican woman, lesbian or whatever, comes along and says something that makes no sense, and everyone's like, yes. And then they cite her from now on and try to build on her work. Or a trans woman comes in, says some ludicrous nonsense about gender identity, and suddenly that's the most cited paper in that subdiscipline. It's just so crazy. So where people would normally be critical when it's not on a politically charged topic, they're completely failing to be critical and thereby failing to do their jobs. And then this additional failure of like, just being a kind of weak-spined person who is not actually doing what our discipline was built to do and what the university is built to protect people to do. And that's all just maybe a depressing way that humans can be useless. I don't know. It's judgmental probably.
Could I ask you, I remember being in contact with you maybe a year ago, and you were going to do maybe a presentation in Harvard where you're going to talk about, is transition ethical?
Oh, Princeton.
And ethic. Yeah, sorry,
yes,
I'm getting mixed up. Tell us about that. It was very interesting.
Yes, no, that was so great, because it's been a really frustrating 6 years or so of just like not getting in anywhere, like not getting desk rejects from journals, and maybe wanting to go and give a talk, but then the department freaks out, or getting uninvited. It's just, so this was amazing because it was the ethics professor, is that what you say? Anyway, the ethicist Peter Singer, the Australian ethicist, he was retiring from Princeton, and he was in his final semester, and I guess he just, I don't know exactly what, did he want to go out in style or use his final, it doesn't really matter if you make some people irritated because you're leaving anyway. I think maybe something like that was the motivation, but he invited me and he said, you can do whatever you like. I'm inviting you and you can give whatever talk you like. And I was like, this is my chance. So I did the talk that had been like niggling at me for years, which was, is it morally wrong for a man to claim to be a woman? Because that, I think, is really at the heart of like so much of the work on trans issues in my discipline just assumes trans women are women. And if they ever say anything about it, it's just like, well, they're marginalized. It's some variation of that. And I really just was like, man, there was a sort of feminist pushback maybe in the 60s, 70s, briefly from like 3 people, but it's really not part of the current debate at all, that there could be something that trans women are really doing wrong to feminism when they make this claim. And I just want to argue for that as best I can. And maybe I can't, and then I'll convince myself that I'm overstating the case. But yeah, so I wrote that talk, went over there, did some other stuff, like gave a guest lecture and gave a talk to a student group. But yeah, and the talk was like very well attended, very constructive. They had an opponent who sincerely disagrees with me give a commentary afterwards. But she did it, like she was there and she did it, and it was all very civilized. Yeah. So that was quite amazing. The only thing that's been slightly frustrating, of course, is that I then wrote it up to submit to journals, and it's been a year and 2 or 3 months of just getting guest rejects, of course, because the journals don't want to publish that. But I've got a backup option. I decided I'll give it a year or a year and a half, and then I'll send it to the Peter Singer's journal, the Journal of Controversial Ideas, and hopefully at least it'll land there.
This reminds me of a point that you make that I wanted to bring up, and it's the idea that one person's value is another person's threat, and that for like gender critical feminists, blind acceptance of identity is a threat, a threat to the feminism and the idea of what a woman is, not a value. And for other feminists, I'll put that in quotes, I mean, it's like the blind acceptance of identity is a supreme value.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, I mean, in that part of the book, I was really trying to figure out these, what looked like intractable disagreements, like just what could be explaining the bizarre impasse that trans activists and gender critical feminists are at, and why is it so intractable? And is it just political, like they're just performing, or is there really something else going on here? So that point was me trying to be like, look, maybe this really just is you see it or you don't see it, like the value and importance of identity per se. I myself don't see it. I just don't see it. I don't care. I don't care about any identity, by the way. It's not just gender. It seems narcissistic and kind of self-obsessed, and I don't understand why everyone's looking inward and downward so much rather than outward at the world. And couldn't you be making all sorts of interesting contributions and making other people's lives better? Why are you so self-obsessed? So I'm just like a very anti-identity person, but maybe some other people see it. And
why is identity inward and downward like that? I mean, why can't identity be also how people see me and my relationships with other people and all my intersubjective dimension? And I mean, it's like, why is it become so like solipsistic, hyper-subjective? It's like there's this weird essence inside of me that no one else can see, and I can say, that's my identity, and if you disagree, well then,
yes.
F you.
But that's an interesting question. You're sort of suggesting that it could have taken another form. It could be like, we have this thing identity, but it's really about like other people thinking I'm generous. And so I'm doing actions to work toward this status that I can maybe earn or can be true, but it's not up to me to decide. I mean, that would be a much better version.
Yeah. I mean,
and if you think about it, in other eras, let's say I definitely would have been Irish or Catholic or whatever, you know what I mean? And that imbued certain senses of, let's say, generous or good fun or whatever, but it was a group identity, which has its own kind of thing. I want to ask you a little bit about what I've noticed in my own world is that gender critical has undergone quite a significant mission creep.
Mm-hmm.
And so people who call themselves gender critical these days, I don't think they are actually gender critical. They have their views around trans, and they're using the word gender critical as a shorthand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not actually what I would think gender critical is. Could you wrote the book on gender critical feminism? So what's your position on that?
I mean, I guess like a lot hangs actually on the attachment of the word feminism to that phrase. This
It
came up
does.
for me several years ago. I was at a like secret workshop of gender critical philosophers, and I was calling us gender critical feminist philosophers. But there were men
Ha.
in the room. Some of the men were Catholic, some of the men were like one of the men in particular who made this point, I think, is basically like, what would be a difference feminist if you're a man, so you're not a feminist? Like, really seems to believe in like the difference of the sexes, and maybe is skeptical about women's disadvantage or discrimination. Anyway, he just raised this what perfectly fair point, but which completely took me by surprise at the time, which was like, maybe that word is not right for us. Like, we, the group of philosophers, we're not gender critical feminists. And somehow I had just been assuming what? Because I was one and they've like joined or something. Joined is the wrong word. It's like they joined me, but they started contributing. Like, one in particular was actually...
They joined the movement.
They joined the movement. And one was like the first of us to even publish in a journal. Like, that was a huge thing. I was so excited to discover him. And then I think I had just been thinking, yeah, they're in the movement now. They're gender critical feminists. Yeah, for them, they're not feminists. So there is this really interesting question of what is the distinction. And actually, coincidentally, my co-author, Kate Phelan, who's another philosopher who's gender critical, we're recording a video tomorrow to try to work out what we think the difference is, because we only know what gender critical feminism is. We don't actually know and have not yet figured out what would be a useful distinction to tell the difference between the people who are just gender critical. And so that, I think, is going to, like, that's your question, I think. Although maybe you're also asking a further question, which is like, not only what's the difference between these men who actually are making substantial contributions to the gender critical project, they're just not motivated by feminism. Maybe you're also asking about, there seems to be a lot of transphobes out there also using this word as a shield.
I'm not quite saying that.
Okay,
but I'm saying something kind of. I'm saying people are calling themselves gender critical. They're not. They've dropped the word feminist. From the phrase very often. So in my world, correct me if I'm wrong, a gender critical feminist gives critique on the impact of gender to women and sees how gender has negatively impacted women and girls, in various different ways. And for example, the trans woman would be an example. Pause there, and then I think gender critical in the world that I'm in these days, which are not filled with feminists, they're just people who call themselves gender critical. So they're gender critical. That's the end of the sentence. And they are that trans is a medical kind of event. It has caused a huge amount of trouble in society. It needs to be called out. People think that they are women when they say they're women. It's not a fact. It's a kind of a bricolage, It's putting something on. It's wearing woman, and that's what gender critical is. So they are very different people. I hope I've made a good fist of it. You can correct me. Yeah.
No. So I agree that there is this difference. So one way I guess we could put it, tell me how this lands with you, because this is just me thinking out loud, would be like, so the gender critical feminist states her tenets, like what she thinks are the commitments of her view. And now there's going to be like some overlap on those tenets, but for different reasons. And I think maybe the different reasons of the merely GC are much more like truth and science than the political needs of feminism. And even when it comes to something like, this actually is helpful for me in the sense that it would explain something weird I've seen going on over one particular type of women-only space. Because if you only care about the truth, like, yeah, there's a biological reality of sex and men can't become women. If that's the thing that's really aggravating you, that would explain why some people say men should not be playing in women's sports because they're men. And so even when you take away, like, oh, they didn't go through male puberty, they don't pose like the rationale for having women-only spaces, you can neutralize their impact on that rationale. The person will still insist this person shouldn't be in women-only sports because they're technically male. And so I think maybe the more that you're motivated just by that kind of truth reasoning, that's the GC, you're not even thinking about what was gender, what were the feminists objecting to, what is a woman-only space for, why do we need it? Because then you'll be sensitive to like when and whether it matters that some trans person is accessing it. So that would be one way to go on the distinction, I guess.
Yeah.
This all makes me think of how this issue of trans has created really unexpected alliances where you have people like Jordan Peterson and Radfeds kind of like pushing in the same direction, and in other circumstances they would be like worlds apart, and they are worlds apart, and yet, but I kind of like that. I really like that, you know, people from vastly different politics can come together and agree on certain fundamental ideas or realities.
I really like it too. Yeah.
On that subject, you know, the name of our podcast is Beyond Gender, and you've written, Sex Matters, you've written Gender Critical Feminists, and your book on the way is Feminism Beyond Left and Right.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled this is coming out. Give us a little bit of a snapshot of where you're going with that book. It'll be out in May, is that right?
I think it is May. Yeah, exactly. This was me being very like intrigued by what was going on in the, what would you call that? The social media,
fascinating.
like feminist gender critical stuff. It just seemed like it had been so heated and hostile over this question of whether feminists can work with the right. And in particular, flaring up over specific incidents where feminists, radfems or gender critical feminists did in fact work in some form with conservatives, people from the right. So I guess I just got intrigued about the controversy, but I've always had an instinct that the what we call pejoratively left purist feminists are being so unreasonable. So that's my starting instinct, was like, this is not helpful, and kind of wanting to see how far that instinct could be vindicated, I guess. So I have ended up arguing with my instincts that there's not really, that the left does not own feminism, that feminism is not a political spectrum located project. It's kind of outside of that. It's like working for the interests of female people, and you can do that regardless of your politics. And then, I guess sort of trying to do the philosopher's job of breaking down some of the claims, like when people say we shouldn't work with or associate with other people, what is it they're actually objecting to and why, going through some of that. And then, kumbaya ending, let's all set our differences aside and do some feminism, something like that.
On a similar note, I would say liberalism isn't the home of, doesn't reside only on the left. I mean, at least here in the United States, it feels like the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, a lot of things that I thought of as being just pillar values of the left, they're kind of on the right now, which is, for me, is like a head bender reminder. But that's kind of how it is, and people on the left are really illiberal and censorious, and it's shocking.
No,
to
and
me.
I still remember when it was like that the Republicans were the anti-science ones because they were climate change deniers, and it was so embarrassing, and everyone on the left was so smug about how we had science and they had wacko made-up beliefs, and now it's us with trans stuff. It's so embarrassing. And I remember how embarrassed I was for the Republicans. I'm just that embarrassed now for the left. So, and that I think that is an observation that partly drives my thinking in the book, and actually the thinking of this other book that I'm relying on in one chapter called The Myth of Left and Right, where they just point out so many of these positions that you would have thought are characteristic of the left or the right, they just shift 10 years later. And the whole thing is just such shifting sands, unstable nonsense. It's really hard to get a grip on any principle or ideological commitment. So if this whole spectrum and an idea of positions is kind of nonsense anyway. Why are you being so tribal about it and yelling at other women who try to do something helpful to make a change because they don't do it with your people? That's just annoying. So yeah, that was a rant more than a.
No, it was good. You got me. I want to ask you, because I didn't know that. Has there been shifting sands? Is there in history, that right wing was free speech in another era and left wing?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because there was obviously Russia. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know
And it's so interesting when you look at all the evidence, which this book I mentioned, these two political scientists, or one political scientist and one other, can't remember. They just put a whole lot of evidence like that together of like, oh, the Republicans were for foreign intervention under this little regime, but then when it changed, then they were anti. Like it's so many things that you might have named as the heart of left or right within that party system that are just absolutely not stable. And yeah, for me, I didn't know that. Yeah, and it is interesting because it's also like, man, people really invoke those categories absolutely all the time. And then it's like sort of almost hard to know what to do with this newfound skepticism, because do you just go around being like a nihilist about everyone's ordinary language, or do you try to find a way to make sense of what they're saying? And
how dare they? We're coming up towards the end. And one question I'd like to ask, I'm not sure if Brett has more, is that I'm kind of conscious, that we're in 3 continents here. You're from New Zealand, living in Australia. I'm in Ireland, Europe, and Brett is West Coast America. What's your kind of bird's eye view of the different continents where they're at? Because I know a new, law was brought into Queensland around puberty blockers, and America is suddenly come from nowhere with Trump and executive orders.
Yeah.
And England has, they were Turf Island a few years ago leading the charge, and now it looks like it feels really stymied in England, which may I say I think we should all learn from. This idea that you can get all things through, and you have Keira Bell and judicial reviews, and you have, JIDs closing down in the Tavistock, and you think it's all over bar the shouting. And then you realize, oh my God, there's years ahead. Hate to be the voice of doom and gloom, but like there is a lesson to be learned. What's your view from over in Australia of the different shifts in the cultures in the continents?
It's a depressing note to end on, I guess, but I have very little hope for Australia, just in the sense that the kinds of changes that we made, they're so much more decisive and hard to unroll. The UK has technically maintained its distinction between sex and gender recognition, whereas we've just gone all in on this one thing, legal sex. And legal sex can be your biological sex, your statutory declaration changed sex, or your gender identity. So it's just completely insane, and recent legal decisions are kind of locking that in. So, yeah, I don't know. We've gone quite far in terms of legislation. We've got conversion therapy legislation that prohibits non-affirmation, and we're about to get vilification legislation, at least in my state, that would prevent ridicule of gender identity. So I just sort of think, and so final thing to say, nail on the coffin, is that the most plausible conservative political leader is apparently just avoiding the issue. So we just don't have any like light at the end of the tunnel for the big turnaround like has happened in the US, or like has slowly been achieved in the UK. I feel very like, we're just going to be that one country that just, I don't know, 10 years later is still having like those weird headlines like, male voyeur in female bathrooms. Like, hey, maybe this law wasn't such a good idea, but we're all kind of stuck with it and don't know how to get a momentum going. I hope I'm wrong, but yeah, I'm not feeling optimistic at all about changing things in Australia. Sorry.
Wow. Yeah, grim.
But maybe feminism, that's a whole different thing. That feels like there's at least some...
Got a new book out.
Yeah, well, there's some appetite, like because I have contact, I guess, with younger people through my teaching, it does seem like certain like younger women are starting to see that liberal feminism is bullshit and it's not really offering them the critical resources that they need. It does seem like there's a sort of hunger and appetite for real feminism, and that is taking people back toward like the radical feminist and second wave text. So I have maybe a bit more hope for like a resurgent feminist movement than I do for like overturning trans laws. Yeah.
I don't have any more questions. I have loved this conversation, though, and
Yeah,
It's been
fascinating.
fun. Sorry if I've been too. I know I'm being a bit argy-bargy. Is that what it's called in the UK? Kathleen called Julie Bindle. She says, "Julie, you're being very argy-bargy today," and I was like, "Okay, that's what I'm being today."
That's a new one.
And I have no idea what that means.
Oh, really?
Like a bit feisty in reply.
Yeah.
Oh, we welcome.
We love feisty.
Feistiness. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. And good luck with your book. I look forward to reading it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Holly.